everyone, and welcome to our roundtable today. I see some familiar faces, which is great. And some of you are new to me, but I'm sure you're probably not new to Plato. So I'll just give you a really quick introduction to what the roundtable is about and what we do at Plato, and then we'll get started. Um, so the roundtable is a space where we have an hour to dig into a topic. We usually have a speaker or two who gives their remarks for about 10 to 15 minutes max. And then we spend the rest of the time having a discussion based on some of the ideas that were raised or any questions that it inspired you to think about. So that's going to be our format for today. And for those of you who are new-ish to Plato, we're an organization that wants to do all it can to bring philosophy into the lives of young people. And we have lots of programming to support that. So we work directly with young people, we work with teachers, we work with parents and communities across generations. Um, we also have a grant program to support philosophy initiatives in different parts of the United States. And if you're interested in some of our offerings and our programming, and in some of the other resources that we have, like our Philosopher's Toolkit, you should check out our website. And if you have any questions, you can direct them to either Karen, myself, or Jean, and we'd be happy to help you out. So welcome to our roundtable today. And Karen, am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so, no. I just popped our website into the chat, and I'm going to put the link to the flyer for upcoming events in the chat also.
Thank you. So Karen and I are facilitating today's roundtable discussion on neutrality in our practice as in doing philosophy with young people. And Karen's going to start us off. But before we do, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Debbie, which I guess I forgot to do at the beginning, and I'm Plato's program director. Karen, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I see some familiar faces here too, or names at least. And it's great to have you all here. Thanks for joining us. So I'm Karen Emmerman. I am the education director of Plato. And I'm so delighted to be here to talk with you all today and think about this topic that Debbie and I in particular have been tossing around back and forth for a number of years and thinking about and wrestling with and talking with others about. So I'm going to say a few things about neutrality, specifically answering the questions or offering answers, I should say, to the questions of what is it, why does it matter, and is it possible? And then I'll hand over to Debbie, who will take it from there. And the idea here isn't to be like the definitive experts on neutrality. The idea is to like sort of get some ideas out there so we can all talk and think about it together. I'm sure you have thoughts about this topic also. So when we do philosophy with young people, right, it's meant to be this space where students express their curiosity and their wonder about the topics of interest to them. So when we think about what is neutrality, right, to me, I think there are sort of like at least three versions of neutrality. One is the idea that it's the stance that prevents facilitators from pursuing their own agendas in philosophy sessions, right? So the idea isn't that we go in and we teach kids what to think or why to think that thing. And neutrality can help us stay in a position of not having an agenda for their thoughts. So, for example, when I'm not doing philosophy with children, I'm a philosopher who works on ecofeminism and animal rights. And so when I do philosophy with young people, I have to be particularly careful to have some real attentiveness to neutrality when we talk about those topics, because I have some pretty established views in the world on those, right? So that's one way to think of neutrality. It's sort of like neutrality that kind of prevents us from bringing our agendas to the table. And then the second way I was thinking about neutrality is some interpret it to mean a neutral affect. So keeping one's facial expressions and tones fairly neutral so that students can't tell what the facilitator thinks about the thoughts that they have expressed. This is a view of neutrality that some colleagues of ours in Denmark were particularly found that they felt was particularly important. So neutrality in terms of agenda, neutrality in terms of affect. And then third, is that neutrality asks us to be neutral to content, even if it's potentially harmful or problematic. So it could mean a certain kind of neutrality about the student's philosophical stance, right? Um, for example, and I don't know, some of us who went to grad school all had professors with this experience who would teach us a philosophical topic, but then tell us which of the views was the right view because that was the view that they support in their own research. I don't know if you, I'll say I had this experience when I was in grad school, right? If you're smart, you'll think this is the right thing, right? So there's a kind of content neutrality around that, right? We're not trying to get students to pick any particular view of free will over any other particular view, regardless of our own personal philosophical commitments. But then it also can mean a kind of neutrality about problematic or harmful statements, or potentially problematic or harmful statements. And that's, I think, the really tricky one, right? Because it raises all these complex questions around how do we assess something for being problematic or hurtful, and what do we do, and those kinds of things. And so that one is pretty controversial and complicated. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of what is neutrality, right? Neutrality about your agenda, potentially neutral affect, and then neutrality about content. Why does it matter? So neutrality in terms of agenda seems to matter because otherwise philosophy for children becomes an indoctrination program, right? Which is totally counter to our mission, right? That's not what we're trying to do. Neutrality in terms of affect may or may not matter. I wonder what you think about that. But one reason people can think it is important is that so the facilitator doesn't risk supporting some students over others by saying things like, great idea, or I really like that because, or, just looking elated when someone says something. I will just say out myself now, I'm terrible at neutrality of affect. Everyone who's ever been in a meeting with me knows this. And also when I teach, I can't do neutrality of affect because I'm so joyful and present when I'm with kids. I cannot. I try to do some neutrality of affect in terms of not praising some ideas and not others, but neutrality of affect is very difficult for me. I'll say that. And then finally, neutrality of content matters, right? As it impacts the kind of space that we create. So should facilitators be neutral to content, letting the community of philosophical inquiry, so the students themselves, right, manages the ideas that are suggested on their own? On the one hand, you might worry that anything other than neutrality on content can slide quickly into enforcing an agenda, shutting down lines of inquiry, and thus kind of failing to provide students a space to work through their ideas and receive feedback from the community about their ideas, right? I mean, this is how we all develop thinking, right? Is we have to be able to knock around ideas with other people in order to sort of hear how it lands with other people, right? And then listen to their reasons. And one reason neutrality of content can matter is because if we don't practice that, then we shut down those lines of inquiry. Alternatively, you might worry that too deep a commitment to neutrality leaves students vulnerable to marginalization and being silenced and being hurt and all the things that can come with it, right? So lastly, is neutrality even possible as a facilitator? So for sure, we can talk about that today. Here are some thoughts I offer from me. I think if we're talking about neutrality in terms of sort of full objectivity or a view from nowhere, then no, I don't think that is possible. But neutrality in terms of agenda, that is possible, right? If we're vigilant about it. Neutrality in terms of affect, I don't know if it's desirable or not. I've certainly seen people do it. Again, I will say it's not possible for me, I think. And then neutrality in terms of content. In the abstract, it does seem possible, right? You could have no response whatsoever to the content of what's said other than to push the students to think more deeply about the issues or the questions raised, right? So you could do that without displaying any particular concern over the content of what was said. In much the same way we push students to think more deeply about ideas and questions that are not problematic. So like when we say things like, can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by respect? Right? There I'm being completely neutral. I'm just asking a person to express in a different or fuller way, right? How they're using a term. But again, this one's harder, I think, than the others because the balance between students trialing thoughts with one another in a space designed for thinking together, revising our thoughts, with others' ideas, and then also maintaining an open and inclusive space is complicated. So that leaves us with the question of whether neutrality is desirable, among other things. And so I pitched to Debbie for that.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate you laying out some language and some framework for helping us think about neutrality and offering agenda, affect, and content as three things to think about when we think about neutrality. So is it desirable, I think, is big and complicated question. And I will try and offer my thoughts in about 1 minute before moving on to some other parts of what I have prepared to talk about today. But in terms of agenda, I think it is, in terms of being open and not pushing an agenda or our own opinion forward in the discussion, I think it is a desirable stance to hold. And, like Karen said, we need to remind ourselves and be vigilant of doing that in an intentional way when we're facilitating a discussion. In terms of affect, is neutral affect desirable? Like Karen, I also often say things like interesting or, oh, I wonder about that. I respond to stuff that my students say, and it often shows on my face. But I think I do that more as a way to acknowledge that here's a philosophically sensitive moment, or like here's something that's interesting that we need to think about or dig more into, rather than here's a perspective I favor over something else. But that being said, this is where it gets complicated, I think. There are so many positionalities in the room, mine included. What might appear, interesting to me may not appear interesting to other people in the group. And also, there's this other layer at play where there are people in the group who are, if from marginalized communities and identities, are trying to already or have gotten cues to conform from a really young age. So to be responsive, to be aware of that within myself and within what's going on in the group, and to think about how my positionality in response to the positionalities in the room may sometimes have something to do with when I decide to say, oh, that's interesting, or when I decide something is philosophically sensitive. And so that's what that I'm constantly doing to expand my understanding and awareness of how many perspectives, or like the fact that there are, as I know this intellectually, that there are many perspectives as there are people in the room, but in practice sometimes holding my like remembering my positionality is an important thing for me to do, and understanding the positionalities in the room. In terms of content, I don't think content can be neutral. I think what we can do is present prompts in a way that invites balanced discussions, but I don't think it's possible for content to be neutral. So I don't think it's something that we can necessarily think about in terms of whether it's desirable or not. I think what's desirable is that we open the space to having a balanced discussion about whatever piece of content it is that we choose to present. So that makes me think about the limits of neutrality, right? What is neutral and objective? I mean, when we say neutral and when we say objective, it's typically what we mean as what is normal, or what is considered normal by the dominant culture and the groups that we're in. And this reminds me of a research paper I often share with my students. I call it the weird sampling paper, and it's weird because it's literally WEIRD, and it's a research paper that shows a lot of the findings in psychology and social psychology that we say, oh, here's how people normally respond, or here's what's typical in a group. We've come to find now over time is actually not typical, because most of the research in social psychology has been done in populations from countries that are weird, which is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So our understanding of what is normal or objective or um, neutral, so to speak, this is how everybody responds, is actually not how everybody responds. And so thinking um, thinking about that, I think, is interesting because it already tells us that neutrality and objectivity is not possible, right? In a way that's the same across all contexts and all populations. And I think another important limitation is thinking about safety, right? And safety of the participants in the community. So if someone says something that causes harm to someone in the room, or even someone who is not in the room for that matter, I think it is the responsibility of the facilitator then to step in. And you could do that by offering a counter question to help think through what was said some more, if that feels appropriate. And in some cases, that's not appropriate. You have to like directly step in and shut it down and explain why that line of thinking might be harmful. So I think that's a limit that we need to be considerate about and careful of. Um, which brings me to thinking about the nature of the space that we want to cultivate in a community of philosophical inquiry. So we say we want our community of in philosophical inquiry to be intellectually safe, and while that's true, we also want it to be what people in education are speaking about a lot of, which is we want it to be a brave space, where we want individuals to be able to offer unfamiliar or uncomfortable perspectives, have that heard, and have that be talked about in a way that's respectful and thoughtful. Um, and so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to really quickly say the last couple of points that I wanted to say about neutrality, and then I'll open it up for discussion. Um, and something that struck me both in my conversations with Karen, in the work that I do, and Karen referred to our colleagues in Denmark, which is where some of this thinking originally started. I think there is something important to be said about the cultural differences in what it means to be neutral. What I think is neutral is certainly not what you think is neutral. What somebody in the United States thinks is neutral is not the same for people in other parts of the world. I, as an immigrant, have a very different idea of neutrality than from someone else. Like it might work for, so if I just take neutral affect, for example, it might work for certain populations where if I go into a classroom and don't have a lot going on with my facial expressions and hand gestures, it might be fine. But if I go to a classroom in India and I teach like that, that's going to cause some sort of stress, because that's just not how it is culturally, right? So someone else might argue the way I'm showing expressions on my face or the way I'm using my hands is making me less neutral because I'm clearly communicating something, even if I'm not using my words to do it. So it's interesting to, I think, consider cultural differences when we think about neutrality. And even thinking about things like the prompts that we bring in. If I were to bring in a story about an immigrant family navigating life in the US, I think it would land very differently because of how loaded that might be for a classroom where most of my kids are predominantly immigrant students, versus a classroom where that's not the case. Not to say that I can't bring that prompt into both those classrooms. I think I can. But I think I just need to be really careful about what that means for both those classrooms, who's in the room, and what kinds of discussions might emerge from it. So I'll just close out and say that I think it's more useful to think about neutrality in terms of epistemic openness and cultural flexibility and contextualization, rather than this this universal objectivity stance that we might take, because I just don't know that that's possible. So I'll end here and open it up to the group. If anyone has any questions, or if you all have thoughts about if neutrality is possible/desirable and what might its limits be. We'd love to hear it.